I've been here almost 11 months, so I'm still relatively new to the company. However, I do have a background in talent acquisition and development. So today we're going to be looking at recruitment, and that is sort of where everything kicks off in the employment relationship. So we're also going to be looking at things like right to work checks and how we store employee records. So recruitment is the beginning of the employee's journey. It's where we need to be aware of employment law pitfalls, but actually it is where people make their first impressions, both you as the recruiter and for the candidate as to you as a company. So it's a two-way process, and it's a chance for the employee to really see whether they want to work for the company as much as whether you want them to work for you. So we say everyone has recruitment experience. Everyone's probably been interviewed once upon a time, so we know what good and bad looks like. But actually, it's so much more than the interview itself. It's the whole process of how we actually start and get those applications through. So what we're going to do today is just look at what the recruitment process looks like. So what should the recruitment process be, and the importance of not discriminating in any part of that process, and what successful hiring looks like for the company. So we're all aware that recruitment has quite a high cost associated with it. It can be very hefty administration wise, and that's why it's really important that it's done right, and we're making sure that obviously the people we are recruiting are the right fit for our business, because we hope people are with us for a very long time, but it's also more tricky once we get to sign contracts to sort of backtrack on any sort of offer that we've made. So that's why this process has to be very thorough. So I am obviously, people run their recruitment processes in very different ways. What we've got here is a standard flow. So this is what system would we use. So generally we would say that where does the authority to recruit come from? So some companies use something called an ATR form, so an authorization to recruit form, which is essentially what a manager would use when they're recognizing that either their employees are overworked, or they actually see there's a skills or a lack of skill maybe somewhere in their team, and they need to recruit someone to fill that slot. So that is identifying the vacancy. What do they need, how are they going to fill it, and what they perceive that being long term. So that would then look at the job requirements and specifications. Like I said, does it require any certain skills? For example, in a financial company, some people need SMCR qualifications, which is basically certification to make sure they're okay to do the role. And that's just the first point. So that's identifying what you think you need. So then generally you'd start to advertise. So you'd be looking at people's CVs. You might go on CV databases. So there's things like Indeed. They tend to be quite popular, and sometimes you might go to an agency, which actually cuts out a lot of this, but obviously there is a very high cost associated with that. So as we said, it's quite high administration wise. So you're advertising on these databases, and then you await. You wait for responses. You wait to see what CVs are coming through. Are they the right fit? And then you start shortlisting for interviews. You might carry out then the first stage of interview, and all the way through you're screening and seeing, and you're still not closing the process. The whole point of recruitment is to keep it very open, so you're getting the very best candidate for your role. So when you might see a perfect CV, you might go to the point where you get to an interview, you think this is it. You then leave all your other CVs, you make an offer and they decline it. So you have to go back to square one. So that's why we always say, make sure you keep it quite open. You're getting a lot of CVs, you're doing a lot of interviews, and you're really making sure that that process is kept as broad as possible, so you have the best selection people or criteria to pick from. So that's why we say here, you're shortlisting your candidates, you're making that offer. Once you've done that, you're inducting and onboarding a new starter. So we'll move on. So at this point, this is where we need to be careful. So discrimination, as we're all aware, can occur at any time in an employee life cycle, and it can occur any time. So what we say here is with discrimination, it's always important to never discriminate. So you want the very best candidate for your role, and you might have some very specific criteria, But irrespective of background and personal situation, everyone deserves an equal chance and opportunity for any role that you may have. So that's why we need to be very careful, because also there are some very serious impacts if we are discriminating. And so, for example, one case we've seen before is during the even the job specification, an individual has raised a claim against that company and gone to an employment tribunal. Now, any discrimination case, and it's regardless of, if they are employed or not, there is an uncapped limit to the amount that someone can claim for if they feel that they have been discriminated against. So it can be an unbelievably costly mistake, and also it's, it's very wrong to even do so. So that's why we always say making sure that the whole way through we're keeping our process very fair and ethical. So one thing to watch out for is protected characteristics. So the Equality Act of 2010 identified all of these characteristics here as protected. So that means you cannot discriminate anyone on the basis of age, sexual orientation, marriage or civil partnership, pregnancy or maternity, religion or belief, race, disability, or gender reassignment. So all of these are protected under that act, and any claim of discrimination can be made based on these protected characteristics. So we have things like we're going to go through it in the next few slides, but there's obviously direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, and discrimination by association. So it's not as simple as just saying, I only want someone who is white and young in my role. It's so much more than that, and that is why we cannot discriminate at all, because actually there is no need to discriminate. There's no need to put a role that is that characteristic and you've specified that. So that's why we always say making sure it's as broad as possible and we don't use any language that we wouldn't feel comfortable saying. So indirect. So we've got here an example of a job ad. So indirect discrimination happens when there is a policy that applies in the same way for everyone, but disadvantages a group of people who share a protected characteristic, and you are disadvantaged as part of this group. So as you can see, this looks like a very standard job advertisement. But at the very bottom here, we've got the ideal candidate must be over 6 feet tall, be strong and physically fit. So by saying that, we are indirectly discriminating against somebody who has a physical disability. So essentially, this advert is discriminatory. So now direct discrimination. So we've got here a food bank manager job specification. And this direct discrimination is when you are treated worse than another person because you have a protected characteristic. So as you can see, this looks fairly innocent. But obviously there is some wording here that says that successful applicant for this challenging post will be a committed Christian and church member. He or she will have excellent communication, organisation, and interpersonal skills supported by relevant previous management experience. Immediately, Christian and church member, that is a protected characteristic because of religion, and that way we cannot discriminate against somebody for that role. And that is why this would be considered direct discrimination. So then we've got discrimination by association. So that describes a situation where an individual can bring a discrimination claim based on not on characteristic on their own, but on a characteristic of another person. So I was thinking about this and thinking what could be discrimination by association. So that an example would be, say you had an employee who you were doing a promotion and you had a list of employees, and actually one of your employees had very, very good scores, very good, what they were doing their role to their expectations and actually going above and beyond. But they were a carer for an elderly relative and you thought, actually, I'm not going to promote them because of that reason. You are directly discriminating against them because of the association that they have as a carer for their relative. So that's essentially those 3 forms of discrimination that we want to avoid at all costs. So permission to spend. So once we've gone through the job, we've created our advertisement that doesn't discriminate against anybody. We are now looking at what we want in our role. So we use the example here of a car. When you go to purchase a car, you're looking for a very specific model. It might be, for example, I've got a recent car and you're thinking, I would love to have heated seats, a sunroof. Obviously, couldn't go for all of that, but you might think I want someone with air conditioning. I'd like it to be a 4-wheel drive. And you've got this amount of money that you want to spend, but you wouldn't go out necessarily and just spend £40,000 on a car without looking at every sort of dealer. I'd be going to all the dealerships to see what I could get for my money and whether it fit my specifications. So we say here, you've been saving really hard, and as a manager, you've got this position that you want to fill, and you know you've got a budget that you've got to fill and you've got to stick within. But actually, you know, you want to get the best out of this £40,000 that you're about to spend. And recruiting someone is a serious investment. So that's why we always say it's making sure to put a list together, to be prepared. What do you want in this person? What would you like to see? What are their capabilities? For example, it might be you want somebody who's really creative, who's able to help you with your marketing strategy, or you know, they might have a bit of experience, but actually you're quite happy to hire a new graduate or a school leaver, somebody who's going to help you within your role. So then what you would do is you'd have a look around, which could be associated to a CV. You'd have a look at people's CVs. You'd ask lots of questions. Going back to our car analogy, you'd be looking at its history. What's its previous performance? You know, what's its mileage? Does it require new parts? And so then what you do once you've found the car that you want to buy, essentially you'd be thinking, okay, what else does it have? What else does it need? So let's say you've got a second-hand car. What would you do next? Generally, you take someone, probably a loved one, to go and look at it with you. You know, you'd spend a lot of time in that car, so you'd want to check other people like it as well. You don't want to lose the car, so it might be a second-hand one, in which case there are few and far between that fit your specification. So you've got to act fast. And you also, you know, so when you know it's the right car, you know it's the right fit, essentially going back to, you know, you found the right candidate, how do you make that offer? How do you buy that car? You know others are also interested. When you find a good candidate, it is very likely, and especially in the market at the moment, they are also fielding offers from a lot of other companies. We're saying it's a buyer's market at the moment, and there is an extreme, all recruiters who we're speaking to are struggling a lot with making sure that they have candidates. There seems to be people's prices are going up, people's salary expectations are going up because they know they're in high demand. So what can we do here? We don't want to lose out on it. What we need to do is think about the amount of time that goes into buying something like a car. That is the same amount of time that needs to go into buying or resourcing a new candidate for our role. So it's permission to spending that money. So the importance of preparation is tantamount in this. So the move prepared, the better the outcome. So the more prepared we are, the better our outcome is that we're going to find the right candidate. We want to act swiftly but purposefully. So we need to understand before we even get started, what is the role, identify where there's a lack or a need. What job specification are we going to advertise to people to make sure we're hitting that need and also getting the right CVs through? What value are we looking for? So in our person, are they fitting in with our company values? Are they going to add something to our team? What selection methods are we going to use? Are we going to do an interview? Is it going to be a 2-stage interview? Going back to the car, are we going to have a loved one or a fellow manager also conduct an interview? Do we need to do something with the team and keep them involved? And that's exactly it. Who is going to be involved in this preparation for our interview to get our candidate on board? So looking at the job specification, we always say it is important to have the main purpose of the role. So I think we're all probably very aware of what a job spec generally looks like. It starts with the company. Some people put salaries on there, and that can be a good idea in terms of making sure people are very, very aware of what the expectations are. But there's also a reluctance, I understand, to do that, especially with the market at the moment, because people do filter out certain vacancies by salary. So if we don't include that, we want to make sure that we are eye-catching. We're getting those people on board. We're showing them what the role's about, what their responsibilities and accountabilities, essentially what are they going to do? What does their day-to-day look like? Do they have the knowledge, skills and experience? Is there a certain caring aspect, or is there a certain qualification that they need? This is like we were going back to the financial SMCR, so they would need to be maybe SMCR regulated. A computer programmer might need a certain Python experience or things like that. Any values and behaviours. So at the bottom we can say a little bit about the company. What do we expect? What do we focus on? And then we consider what is essential and what is desirable. So you might have, for example, a let's say a modern languages teacher. You would like them to be able to speak French and German, but actually it'd be quite nice if they spoke Spanish and Italian as well. So it's things like that, and we can put that into our job ads and make it so we are making sure that those people are seeing the role and they're applying because they think that it applies to them. So once the requirements of the job are established and the responsibilities and tasks of the position, they should be detailed in the role profile. So we're demonstrating the relationship between the specific activities and tasks and then the personal attributes required to take them. And then the role profile essentially provides clarity on what is expected by the job holder. This just helps in the recruitment process that they come to the interview very aware of what they're interviewing for, and also they're coming asking questions that are relevant. So there's no surprises. It helps with you not wasting your time. As we said before, admin and recruitment is a very, very long process. So making sure that we're very clear up front is then making sure that we're getting the best people who are coming forward for the role and they're prepared and they actually can do the role that we're requiring. So then we go into a company's values. So this should be an extension. This should be an extension of your personal values. So this is what is creating your culture. So as a company, you should live and breathe your values. If you're an owner or a managed business, the company values should be the same as that. So for example, we say these are the principles by which the company wants all of its employees to demonstrate and behave. So there are practices that we need to make sure we're including. These values must provide a clear measure of performance. So they could align with the core values of, like we said, of the owner, and they drive its culture and what is seen by customers as well. So for example, for Compass, this could be what an individual is seeing on the website. I know there are companies such as Glassdoor. We don't necessarily recommend them as much because a lot of people or anyone can make a Glassdoor comment, but it's things that when people type in Compass, what is coming up? What are they seeing? What are they understanding about your business? What's important to you? So it's all these things that generate an impression by somebody, and that's making sure that we're also very aware that when we go into an interview, I think one of the most common interview questions is, what are your company's values and do you align to them? So it's just making sure that we're very clear on what our values are, what we're aiming towards, and what we're trying to achieve by the people who we have around us and we are recruiting. So then we're going into the selection principles. And sorry, I'll slow down a bit. I've just realised I'm going quite fast. But so essentially, the selection principles, we need to make sure that we're effectively selecting the right people for our business. So it is essential to recruit the people with the right values, skills and experience to drive your business forward. As we said before, it's a costly mistake. The administration involved in recruitment is a lot, but it's also a lot to put effort and time and money and resources into new starters. I don't know how many people have run an induction process or an onboarding, but that is quite a lot of work to get somebody up to speed, and it is made 10 times harder when you don't have the right person for the role. So selection methods that we use, they need to be consistent and measure what they're intended to measure. So if that's someone's knowledge on a certain area, we need to make sure that that is put into the interview process. So we are not wasting our time when it comes to the first day. We ask somebody to do something and they say, I've never done that before, even though on their CV it says they have. People's CVs, I don't want to say people lie, but everyone exaggerates slightly the truth. If my manager's watching, I did not. But everyone is looking at their CV and they are thinking of ways of how to present themselves best. It's like a social media profile almost. No one's going to post on purpose a horrible picture of themselves. So no one on their CV is going to put all the negative information, anything that wouldn't be seen as beneficial to them. So that's why we always say it's quite good to have some sort of criteria that you're measuring people on to ensure that you are hiring the right person for that role. So when we say we choose a selection method or a combination of selection tools, we need to make sure they're actually appropriate for the job role. So in HR, or better not restart my computer. In HR, for example, I wouldn't be expected to know Python. I would hope not anyway. So I would hope in the interview process, I wouldn't be asked on how to code a new website, because obviously that is not something I'd be able to do and I would fail miserably. And that would be beneficial for actually what I do in my day-to-day role. So it's things like maybe someone might say to me, you know, what's an appropriate thing for me? It might be of how would you have a difficult conversation? How would you go about calling somebody into a meeting? Maybe even writing an email, things like that. They would be considered appropriate. So here are some different selection methods that you can pick and choose. We wouldn't always say do all of them because that would make a very, very long process. But for example, our first one is always a telephone screening interview. I always recommend this in the first instance. When you get somebody's CV, I always think it's quite nice to send them an email, or you can call them saying, you know, I'd say, I'm Laura from the HR department, just seen your CV, really interested to book in an interview with you. And it's just having that initial conversation. Then you would have a telephone interview in addition to this. So this would be in the interview stage, having that chat that people tend to be more confident over the phone than necessarily over video chat, and that's always a bit more of a beneficial way. You can keep it to about half an hour, 20 minutes, and it's just a very initial screenshot or snapshot as to see if they're the right person for you. So then we can do work sample tests or a trial shift. This might be beneficial when you need to see somebody in action, whether they're able to do the role. Role play. So they tend to be more common in things like assessment centres when you might have multiple people you're trying to hire for one role. Role playing with someone else. I think once upon a time I worked at a retail company and they made me role play a customer, giving a basically who tried to steal something, and I remember feeling very uncomfortable because I was only about 15 at the time, and I remember thinking, oh, this is not the right place for me to role play with a senior manager, and it didn't feel right, I'm going to be honest, because I wouldn't have been put in that position in real life. So it's things like making sure, again, they're appropriate. So presentations, so what we could do is you ask them to put together a presentation. You give them a job spec, or you give them maybe a brief, in which case it could be, you know, actually put together a business plan. We're planning on doing this. We want you to present to us. We're going to give you 5 minutes to present. Or you could say, we'd like to see 3 slides on XYZ, a subject, and they can go away and come back. And actually, sometimes that's quite nice because it makes sure they're very prepared, and they also are quite passionate. They generally choose something that they're quite keen on talking about, and actually you get to see then somebody, one, their output for their work, but also you get to see a bit of their personality. Again, so you can do these ones, personality profile, psychometric tests. They tend to be more popular in things like graduate schemes. They do quite a few of these. It's those sort of tricky ones. Can you spot the difference? What's this logic puzzle? Can you work this out? Or other ones can be lots of different questions about scenarios. They end up giving you your personality types. These can be like a MBTI, Myers-Briggs. I would recommend everybody to do that, by the way, because they're always very interesting. Again, we talked about assessment centres. This is when you tend to have lots of people for a role. They tend to be quite common for graduate schemes, and it can be when you basically put people together, you give them scenarios, and that is a way to see how people interact, and you get more out of that in terms of personality. At the moment with COVID, a lot of people are doing Zoom interviews. That's how I got this job, actually, because we were in the middle of the pandemic still. And it's just essentially, instead of a face-to-face interview, it works the same and you're still able to have those conversations. We always say here, always keep an accurate record of your selection process. This is to make sure it's standardized and also so you can look back on, whether it worked or not. Okay, so now you're in the interview. Effective interviewing is a vital part of the selection process. So this means that we need a consistent approach that is both professional and efficient. We use the price analogy here. So prepare, report, interview, close, and evaluate. One reason that consistency is important is that we must ensure that all candidates we interview are given a fair opportunity. So I don't know if anyone's aware here of something called unconscious bias, but that is just something that's ingrained in us from, it can be nature or nurture. It can be something that we've developed over our whole life and we're not aware of it, but we do have biases against people, and that's something we need to be very aware of, and making standardized approaches, ensuring things like the interview process is standard, helps us to avoid those biases. So we believe that one way to achieve consistency is to use this structured approach. So you're preparing for the interview, like we've gone through. You've built that rapport with the individual. You then hold the interview and you will have a set list of interview questions. We always recommend that you use very standard questions, which you can then adjust, but actually then you know you've answered or asked, say, 10 interviewees, all the same question. It's easier to evaluate based on that. You then close the interview and then after you would evaluate. So we would say here, in the close part, that's allowing the people to ask any follow-up questions. It's also to see whether after the interview they write you a nice little note saying thank you for your time, little things like that that just help you make a decision on whether they're the best person for your role. So then we look at question types. So I mentioned before that it is a very good idea to have these questions already spelled out and also using a variety. So we say here closed. So these are easy and quick to answer. An example could be, how many years have you been in your role? It could be, anything that's got almost not one word, but, a very short answer. They're easy and quick to answer. They improve the consistency of the responses. They're easy to compare with other respondents. So if you're looking for experience, that could be one question which helps you evaluate across all 10 candidates. So an open question, these permit an unlimited range of answers. They reveal how respondents think about the question, and their responses can be used to expand and clarify on closed responses. So it could be, how many years have you been in your last role? And then you can say, actually, you've been in that role a long time. What motivated you behind your decision to take that last role? What motivates you in general? How would you define success in your role? When have you been successful in your last role? Things like that can be linked and to basically gather a better idea and understanding of that person. Probing questions. So these allow for multiple responses. So you can avoid here yes or no answers, and you get more detailed explanations. So it's moving the thinking from reaction to reflection. So I've got some examples here, sort of, saying someone's asked a question, you can say, why do you think that is? You mentioned before you're motivated in this way. Why is that? How did you come to this conclusion? So it's building on the open questions and drilling in deeper. Leading questions. So these ones tend to be a little bit more for senior or salespeople. They're to see if they know enough and also if they're confident enough to disagree. So, for example, a nice leading question might be, do you agree that attention to detail is an important quality at work? So you're giving someone an opinion and they can agree or disagree. Another one, which isn't, I don't think, the best example, but it's, why did you hate your last job? Which I always think is a bit of an inappropriate one, but actually they can build that in a certain way, say, no, I didn't, but actually it's a, I want to expand my learning, I want to do this. And it just helps to open up that conversation to get the best out of people. I wouldn't necessarily recommend using why did you hate your last job, but I thought it was quite a interesting example. So listening skills. So at the moment, I have terrible listening skills because I haven't listened to what anyone's saying, or I'm aware of that. But in an interview, it is so important to actively listen. So it's awareness and it's making the effort to listen to what people are saying. So it's very easy when you're doing a lot of interviews to have interview glaze, which I say is when you basically glaze over and you're asking the questions and you're thinking, I've got these 10 standard questions, I've got 10 interviews to do today, and you just cannot fathom doing another question. You can't fathom asking it, but it is so important. As we said, this interview process is your first contact point with that individual who could be working with your company. It could be a future co-worker. So it's really important that we show a genuine interest. We're curious, we're jotting down our notes, we're understanding any questions they ask. We don't always have to know the answer, but we make sure we get back to them. We're aware of their emotions. So are they a passionate person? Are they explaining something that they really love? They are being aware of bad habits. So that could be, sort of gazing into the distance. If you're on a Zoom call, it could be looking down at your phone when it's ringing. It's reading their body language and it's not interrupting them, which I will say everyone here is doing very well today. But it's also just making sure that you're actively listening to someone so that actually when they've asked or answered your question, when you're asking another question that might link back to that, it's making those linkings, it's building that rapport and that respect. It shows you're engaged, and actually it makes the person feel valued, and it makes them feel like they are being listened to and they are using their time to do this interview. And I know it's very easy sometimes to think, well, I'm interviewing them, they want the job, but it is important that we are showing them the respect. They have come prepared, if they've come prepared, and that they have showed up on time and they're there and they're talking to us, and that's really important. So now we're on to, you've made your offer and you're looking at whether the person has the right to work in the UK. This has become more complicated, obviously, for pretty obvious reasons, recently. So it's establishing whether the person can legally work in the UK prior to them starting. That should be the first question. Once they've signed up or you've made that offer, you always put, say, for example, if you use an offer letter, there would always be the caveat subject to them being able to work in the UK. Again, that's included in most standard employment contracts. It's looking at what documentation they have, and the implications of getting it wrong is it can cause a major expense to the company. So at the moment, what should we do? So right to work checks generally is a passport, and what we ask is people to send through a copy of that passport. We would then call them. So at the moment, if you can't see them in person, we would call them over video chat. We'd ask them to hold up a copy of their passport, and we would see and check it that way to check that that copy that we've been sent is the same as what's in their hand with them in the screenshot as well. So we're able to do an identity check essentially. There has been cases where this hasn't been done. My colleague Nicola has a very, very good story about essentially somebody showing up to work who wasn't the same person as what originally came through in their documentation, but it wasn't caught out until the person was doing the role, and then they realised actually they are unable to do it. They didn't have the qualifications to do it, and they actually got a professional interviewer who was doing a lot of interviews for different people, getting the roles, and then someone different would show up. I don't think that's common. I haven't seen that, but Nicola does have a very good story about that one. But it's just making sure that we are checking that. We are checking people's right to work. If they've got a basically, sometimes people have a sponsorship or a visa. This could be a working visa. Normally they would be given a share code that you can then check online. It comes up with a picture on the UK Gov website. and you're able to see if that person has the right to work in the UK. So it's just making sure that we are conducting those checks. And if you're ever unsure, it's always important to ask and to see what documentation they do have, because like we said, it can cause a major expense. So it's really, really important that it is done, and it can't be done by a third party. It has to be done by the company. So contracts. So the Good Work Plan, don't know how aware people are of this, came into play in 2020. So part of this was making sure that companies are explicit about the benefits and also all of their offerings to employees. So as part of the Good Work Plan, an employee needs to be given a contract on their very first day. So before that would be brilliant, but they need to have a contract on their first day of employment. It can't be something an afterthought. It has to be given to them and signed. So it should cover things like everything: your sickness, holiday. It's essentially all the things that they are entitled to. Is there training involved in their role? Is that something the company provides? Do they get a bonus? What's their pay? What's their days of work? Everything should be included in that contract. If it's not signed and they still turn up, then essentially we would ask them to sign the document. But essentially, if you're looking back now at your contracts and you're seeing it's unsigned, generally if someone's been working on that contract and it's unsigned, it is implied that they agree to the terms of that contract. So when we say what if they don't sign it, always have a conversation. Notice you haven't signed your contract. Is there something wrong here? You know, what can I do to help? Would you like to talk about some of the terms, and having that conversation? So we say, can it be changed? Yes, you can change a contract of employment. However, you have to enter a consultation period. This has to be about 30 days, and it has to be done in a way in which you inform the employees that you're willing to change, or you're wanting to change a term, the reasons why, and also allowing them the opportunity to ask any questions that they may have. So what other documents should be provided to the new employee? So GDPR, we have to provide a data privacy notice. This is to say what we're doing with the individual's information, how we are storing it, who to go to if there was ever a data breach, or who's in charge essentially of our data. They need to have that. An employee handbook. This is where we would list all the policies. So you might make reference to how many days holiday in the contract, but in the handbook it should say, you know, a little bit more boomph about how they book their holidays. Who do they go to should they be ill whilst on holiday? Is the company liable to pay for any costs if the employee books a holiday before telling anybody? Things like that all go in the handbook. There's also a bit about the role profiles. So that's the job description. That's something that should be done before even the interviewing stage starts. It's giving that person an idea of what they're going to be doing, and then things like key objectives and performance measures. So just making sure that they're fully aware of their role and really set up and ready for their new day. So it's storing employee records. Now, this is something which has become more important because of GDPR. Why we store things is because we need to have that as a record. Things like people's contracts, they are something we can rely on if there are any issues moving forward. And it is important that we store them in a secure location. So that could be where, if you have an HR information system, it could be on there. If you're storing hard copies, they need to be locked away safely. What are we saving and what are we storing? So that could be the right to work checks, people's proof of identity, so a scan of their passport that would go alongside a signed contract. It's things that you feel are needed. So if, for example, you might have people who've been off sick, you'd want to store doctor's notes, fit notes, that for your payroll records, you have that. So, for example, we said there, an HR information system. Do you have one? Do you use an Excel document where people book all their holidays off? Where is that stored? Is it saved in a saved folder? Is it password protected? It's just keeping in mind what we are doing with that employee record. If someone stole our computer and logged on, would they be able to see all this information that's private and confidential and personal to people? How are we storing it? Again, who's storing it? When? Sorry, there's a lot of questions there about storing employee records, but essentially it's thinking to yourself, how would I like my information stored? I like it to be kept confidential. I wouldn't want anybody to be able to pick up my contract and see it. So we're just making sure that the people who need to see it are able to see it, but actually it's secure. It's in a secure location, either locked away or password protected, or on an HR information system, which again is password protected, and only managers or people of, senior managers or directors are able to see those information. So any further questions? We've come to the end of it. I'm sorry, I feel like I've talked everyone's ear off, but
Thank you.
yeah, open up
Thank you
the
so
floor.
much, Laura. It's really great.